Here we're looking still with MacIntyre's After Virtue. We're now in chapter 3, Emotivism, social content and social context. So remember, in chapters 1 to 2, he's identified his project. That is that we've had a shattered sort of morality, that our current system of morality isn't a system at all. It's just it's shattered. The governing theory is or idea of it is emotivism, and this is not a good theory. It's not an accurate theory. It's a misleading theory about morality. But it says basically that sort of the natural state of morality, the essence of morality, is disagreement, and that's just the way it is. So it's not a historical accident. Now, in these chapters, like about chapters 3 to 6, MacIntyre is going to look back into history to try and establish, no, it's not part of the essence of morality to be all broken up like this. Something happened to it, and there's a reason for it. There's a historical reason, and he's going to look back into the Enlightenment and how it's connected with this. Attempt to put all the pieces back together. So it's, in a way, it's kind of a Humpty Dumpty story, but it's not going to work, right? This sort of rational foundational approach to ethics is not going to be that which puts Humpty Dumpty back together again. You need something different horses and different king's men. So in this video, and probably the next one as well, I'm just looking at the highlights of chapters 4 to 6. So in this one, 3 to 6, I'll look at chapters 3 and 4, and then have a peek at 5 and 6 in the next video. So in chapter 3, it's Emotivism, social content, and social context. And he starts by saying that a moral philosophy presupposes a sociology, namely that the concepts of that moral philosophy are embedded in a society. Emotivism says, as we've seen many times, that moral claims are just expressions of feelings and the attempts to change feelings of others, right? It's just an expression of approval, and I disapprove of that, and you disapprove as well, and I try to get you to disapprove so that we both come to the moral judgment of that's wrong. But ultimately, it's just an expression of our of the fact that we're disapproving. And if that's really the case, well, then all moral discourse is really manipulative. That's all it is. It's just the expression of my view, and I'm trying to change you to express basically what I'm expressing. So it's not really rational discourse. And it's about power, right? Well, we've heard that before in the likes of Foucault and whatnot. So this idea of emotivism really is that, it's just about morality is really just about power, expression of it, and the motion of it, etc., etc. It's not about rationality. It's about power. And MacIntyre says, yeah, if you look at the history of literature and bureaucratic structures, you'll find this sort of manipulative form of moral discourse. This all gives rise to what MacIntyre calls the emotivist self. And the emotivist self is a self that's cut off from tradition. So this theme, this idea of fragmentation and decontextualizing, it applies to the kind of self that is in the story as well. So this is a historical story, so that humans became sort of cut off. Sometimes we hear this in the likes of, in modernity, right? The individual was cut off from tradition and became sort of really sovereign. Sometimes people say, Kant got rid of God from morality, had the moral law, but ultimately put the entire weight on the individual's shoulders, like made people into little gods, little deciders in that sense, in his efforts to make morality completely free. So you were free of everything, but then through the freedom of everything, you're isolated as well. So the emotivist self then finds it's isolated, cut off from tradition, so it either can be living free and isolated from society, in which it's free and kind of arbitrary decisions are completely sovereign, or it can live confined within some kind of bureaucracy that is sovereign and then limits the self's freedom. So modern politics, MacIntyre holds, oscillates between this kind of wild freedom and this collectivist control. And he thinks that ultimately this sort of wild freedom and collectivist control, these two modes have sort of partnered, and you get this sort of kind of bureaucratic individualism. All right. So the self, what's really happened, so the big picture is the self has moved from this, shall we say, embodied in this traditional sort of background into an emotivist form. And there's been a history also in the changes in the self and, you know, how humans basically live. There's been a change in the forms of moral discourse as well. So let's look a little bit more at, so that's roughly what he's after in chapter 3. So in chapter 4 now, in chapter 4, he's talking about the predecessor project and the Enlightenment, or sorry, not the predecessor project. Whoop. Predecessor culture. Whoops. There we go. The predecessor culture and the Enlightenment project of justifying morality. So the predecessor culture is this Enlightenment culture, and the Enlightenment had this project of trying to justify morality. So what does that mean? So our general culture and academic philosophy and this whole sort of big mix are the offspring of this earlier culture in which society and philosophy were deeply mixed, right? Much more than they're mixed today. Academia is actually quite distinct, right? But in this predecessor culture, 18th century Enlightenment culture, there was a real, like a true mix. And you can read about MacIntyre's descriptions of this culture, but there was a real mix of, you know, morality and philosophy and culture. It was truly all part of a whole. But as morality started to split, started to hive off, it began to take up its own domain, right? So prior to the Enlightenment culture, morality and like theology and a lot of these things were largely of a piece, okay? But philosophy, you know, in this mix with society, started to kind of hive off a bit from tradition. And in that sense, what you get is that the Enlightenment had this goal, according to MacIntyre. The goal of Enlightenment culture was to provide this independent justification of morality, because morality was breaking away from theology and its traditional moorings in tradition and theology. And so the Enlightenment project was to find another basis for it, not to leave it hanging, but to give it another basis and a public basis, right? Not just an arbitrary one and not just a unique one or a series of them, but to give it a new foundation. What's it going to link it all up? And so MacIntyre says, well, look, in the end, the thesis of After Virtue, of the whole book, is that the breakdown of the Enlightenment project, the breakdown of the project of justifying morality, that's a background that you need against which the predicaments of our culture, all this fragmentation, can be understood. And so MacIntyre is going to look at some major figures and work his way backward in history. And so one of the major figures of this, of this showing how this Enlightenment project to rationally ground of morality in a new way, independently of all these other kinds of traditional ways that it was grounded. He starts with Kierkegaard and Kierkegaard's attempts to ground morality in the individual's choices, right? And sometimes regarded as the earliest forms of existentialism, right? You know, everything's grounded in personal choice. And so he does a little analysis of Kierkegaard, and which I'm not going to summarize here. But the main point is that MacIntyre thinks that Kierkegaardian project falls within the Enlightenment, general Enlightenment project, and his project fails. Goes back to Kant, right? So it goes back a little bit more in time. And what did Kant do? Well, Kant didn't try to ground it in, you know, individual choices. He's not an existentialist in that sense that Kierkegaard argued could be. Although, you know, maybe one might say this is a bit misreading of Kierkegaard because he was a Christian existentialist. But anyways, but let's let that go. So MacIntyre thinks that the Kierkegaardian project of choice as a rational foundation fails. Kant's project of grounding rational, or sorry, grounding, having a rational ground of morality in reason. That too, he thinks, very interesting, valiant attempt, but it fails. So you can see this. Now he's going to go back and pick out other figures in this Enlightenment project, which is basically a number of these great thinkers of the time. Diderot is another one. Grounding morality and desires, that fails too. And of course, if you think about grounding morality and desires, passions, well, you're on the way to that great Scottish thinker, David Hume, and who tried to ground morality in the passions. So Diderot and Hume are similar in that sense. So we've got grounding in choices, doesn't work. Grounding in reason, doesn't work. Grounding in passions and desires, not going to work. And so this morality of our predecessor culture, the predecessor culture being Enlightenment culture, and our own, what did it really lack? It lacks a public, shared, rational justification of morality. And also, philosophy really loses its central role in our discussions of morality as well. It becomes a narrow, marginal discipline. Why? Well, why did philosophy move from being part of the mix here? Is this project failed? So philosophy essentially failed. And so when it failed at this project of grounding rationality, well, MacIntyre is really saying it retreated. It's like, I couldn't do that, so let's go do logic or whatever. So philosophy basically retreats from the public sphere and becomes this very narrow academic kind of discipline, like a part of the academy, right? So people in the general stop talking philosophically because he thinks philosophy had its shot and it didn't work. It failed. And so then you get philosophy as becoming, and even with one of the things about the positivists and the emotivists and all that, philosophy had less and less and less and less to do, right? It wasn't providing big schemes anymore. It wasn't going to ground morality. And it wasn't going to talk about the general structure of reality like in metaphysics. That's all science now. So philosophy just basically shrivels up, and it might be powerful and all that, but within a very confined space. It doesn't provide the ground of rationality that religion once did. So philosophy was supposed to take over, right? In the olden days, in medieval times, philosophy was kind of the handmaiden of religion, as they used to say, like the servant, the helper type, to modernize the metaphor. But no, it didn't do that at all. So it failed. The whole project failed, and it couldn't work to provide this grounding of morality in this world of secular rationality. So ultimately, it retreated. So there you go. There's the first couple of big points in chapters 3 and 4. And in the next video, we'll look a little more deeply, and we'll turn to chapter 5.